Blockbuster didn't collapse when Netflix won. It collapsed when it still seemed impossible to lose.
And almost no one noticed when it started. In the early 2000s, stores were still full. Friday night still had the same predictable ritual. Kids picked out animated movies. Adults debated which new release to take home. People walked between shelves organized by genre, holding empty boxes that represented stories stored behind the counter. Fluorescent lighting, worn carpeting, colorful covers lined up in rows that seemed permanent. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing indicated fragility. And that's exactly how systems start to fail. Not when they seem weak, but when they seem too stable to be questioned. The customer would walk in, choose a movie, pay for the rental, take the DVD home. This fee was seen as an operational detail, a small mechanism of discipline. But quietly, it represented hundreds of millions of dollars a year. It wasn't just a penalty. It was a structural part of profitability. Removing it would mean tampering with the financial heart of the model. At its peak, the company operated thousands of stores around the world. The blue and yellow logo was too familiar to seem questionable. In many cities, it was as common as supermarkets or pharmacies. Physical presence was synonymous with strength. Contracts with major studios guaranteed early releases. Logistics were efficient. Cash flow was predictable. Reports confirmed consistent growth. When a model produces results repeatedly, it ceases to look like strategy. It starts to look like nature. Blockbuster didn't seem to be taking risks. It seemed to manage stability. And prolonged stability reduces urgency. Meanwhile, in the late 1990s, a small company was trying something different. It didn't require travel. It didn't require queuing. It didn't require rushed returns. The customer chose online. The disc arrived in the mail. Then it was returned in a prepaid envelope. No late fees. At first, this seemed irrelevant. The internet was slow. Buying online still seemed strange. Waiting a few days for a movie didn't seem like progress. Blockbuster was infrastructure. The other company was an experiment. The comparison seemed uneven. But there was one detail. Customers who tried the new model described something difficult to measure: absence of friction. They didn't have to remember the return date. They didn't have to reorganize their week to avoid a fine. They didn't have to fight over the last copy of the new release. The change was not dramatic, it was comfortable. And comfort changes habits more effectively than disruption. The difference seemed too small to alarm the market. The online company's growth was modest. The stores remained full. Revenue continued to come in. Reports were still positive. Nothing suggested immediate disruption. Executives followed digital trends. They analyzed reports, they observed online growth. Nothing was ignored. But the numbers still did not justify radical transformation. Eliminating fees would mean reducing predictable revenue. Reducing physical expansion would mean slowing visible growth. Maintaining the system seemed consistent. It seemed rational.
Confidence rarely sounds exaggerated. It sounds reasonable.
Blockbuster did not operate based on explicit arrogance. It operated based on contextual consistency. The recent past validated the present. Each positive quarter reinforced the idea that gradual adjustments would suffice. Meanwhile, the small digital company adjusted its own model. Instead of charging for individual rentals, it introduced a monthly subscription. Customers paid a fixed amount and could receive movies continuously. This detail quietly changed incentives. The more customers used the service, the greater their perception of value. There was no penalty for late returns. There was no invisible countdown. The experience was no longer transactional. It became relational. Still, none of this seemed urgent from the perspective of the dominant leadership. Physical stores continued to operate. Their presence in the territory was widespread. The brand was well known. Large systems rarely react to small movements. They wait for unequivocal evidence. And at that moment, the evidence still seemed insufficient. But the shift had already begun. Not in reports, not in storefronts, in expectations. When consumers experience a model with less friction, they rarely return entirely to the previous model. At first, they alternate, then they replace. This transition does not occur in a single quarter. It occurs in direction. And direction is difficult to see when volume is still favorable. Blockbuster believed it had room to adapt when necessary. Time to react. Time to integrate digital solutions. Time to correct. Time seemed abundant. And time is the variable that confidence most underestimates. In 2000, the founders of the online company approached Blockbuster's leadership. They made a direct proposal. They offered to sell the company for approximately $50 million. Blockbuster's response was simple. No. Blockbuster owned the stores. It had contracts with studios. It had a massive customer base. Within that logic, acquiring a company that sent DVDs by mail did not seem like an essential move. The decision was not made with disdain. It was made with consistency. The traditional model still generated billions. Physical presence still dominated neighborhoods and shopping centers. The flow of consumers still validated the system. When the present confirms stability, the future rarely seems urgent. The proposal was rejected. At that moment, nothing suggested that this decision would be remembered as a turning point. While stores continued to operate normally, the digital system continued to learn. Each movie chosen online generated data. Each review filled out revealed a pattern. Each return helped map individual preferences. Gradually, the company ceased to be just a mail logistics company. It became a recommendation engine. Physical shelves organized titles by genre. Algorithms organized titles by behavior. The difference seemed technical, but it was structural. One system depended on geographic location. The other depended on information processing. One required physical expansion to grow. The other scaled through software. In the beginning, the growth of the digital model was steady but discreet. A few million subscribers did not seem like a threat in the face of thousands of physical stores around the world. But digital growth follows a different dynamic than physical growth. Physical infrastructure requires investment proportional to each new unit. Digital infrastructure allows for expansion without replicating costs in the same proportion. Blockbuster watched, but it still did not feel enough pressure to reconfigure the core of its business. The stores were still full on Fridays. New releases still generated queues. The brand was still dominant. Nothing indicated urgency.
They didn't ignore the signs. They just believed there was time.
Over the years, resistance to late fees became more visible. What once seemed like an acceptable detail began to seem like avoidable friction. Consumers began to compare experiences, driving to a store, looking for parking, finding out that the title was sold out, remembering the return date. None of these tasks were dramatic in isolation, but together they represented a cognitive cost. When a system removes cognitive cost, it profoundly alters expectations. Blockbuster decided to eliminate late fees at a certain point. The correction came. But it came in response to public perception, not as a structural anticipation. And by eliminating the fees, the company gave up a significant portion of its revenue. The change reduced friction for the customer, but it also reduced financial margins. Reactive systems operate with less room for error. Even so, internal perception remained controlled. There were digital plans. There were online tests. There were attempts at adaptation, but adapting a consolidated physical structure takes time. And time does not expand just because it is desired. While Blockbuster needed to sustain thousands of real estate contracts, local teams, and complex logistics chains, the digital company focused its resources on improving the online experience. The paradigm began to shift. When streaming became technically feasible at scale, the nature of competition changed again. Delivery no longer depended on the mail, it now depended on broadband. What once required waiting became instantaneous. Blockbuster tried to respond. It launched online initiatives, it adjusted strategies, but it carried the accumulated weight of the previous model. Thousands of stores cannot be closed without profound impact. Employees cannot be laid off without social and financial costs. Contracts cannot be terminated without penalties. The structure that once represented an advantage now represented inertia. When systems compete under different rules, adaptation does not depend solely on intention. It depends on agility, and agility is limited by structure. At this point, the difference between the two models was no longer just technological. It was temporal. One operated with long decision cycles, the other with short iteration cycles. The margin that had seemed abundant years before was beginning to narrow, but collapses rarely announce their onset with noise. They advance silently, while reports still show defensible numbers. Blockbuster did not seem to be in a panic. It still seemed confident, and prolonged confidence can delay the perception of structural change. When it finally declared bankruptcy in 2010, the process did not occur as a sudden explosion. It was gradual. Stores closed progressively. Territorial presence shrank. The brand became a cultural memory. The collapse did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It was a sequence of belated adjustments. Each isolated decision had a plausible justification. Each choice seemed coherent in the context in which it was made. The company did not ignore the internet. It believed it could integrate it at the right time. But the time that seemed available was already compromised. And when perception finally aligns with structural reality, the margin for reaction is no longer the same. The visible event was the rise of the digital competitor. The invisible process was the confidence in the permanence of the physical model, and processes are difficult to see while they still seem reasonable. Blockbuster did not fall because it was unfamiliar with technology. It fell because prolonged stability reduced the sense of urgency proportional to the emerging risk. When the last store closed, the collapse was just a formality. The real change had occurred years earlier, when maintaining the system seemed like a safe choice, when adapting seemed hasty, when time seemed sufficient. And time, once again, was the underestimated variable. Bankruptcy formalized what had already been happening invisibly. But the story is not about bankruptcy. It is about margin. For years, Blockbuster operated under a central premise. The model was solid. The infrastructure was extensive. The brand was recognized. The risk was manageable. This premise was not absurd. It was based on historical evidence. Each positive quarter reinforced the belief that gradual adjustments would suffice. Each busy store reinforced the sense of permanence. Each renewed contract suggested continuity. Nothing indicated imminent collapse, and that is precisely what makes the pattern recurring. Systems rarely enter into crisis when they are visibly fragile. They enter into crisis when they seem too robust to be questioned. Blockbuster was not surprised by a single disruptive innovation. It was slowly displaced by a change in the definition of convenience. First, no fees. Then, the monthly subscription. Then, personalized recommendations. Then, streaming. Each step seemed incremental. None seemed, in isolation, sufficient to bring down thousands of physical stores around the world. But systems don't fail because of a single blow. They fail when small accumulated changes exceed the projected margin. Blockbuster believed it had time to react, time to integrate technology, time to preserve the traditional model while experimenting with the new, time to adjust without compromising the existing base. But time is not a fixed resource. It is variable, dependent on structural speed. While the digital company operated with short cycles of testing and adaptation, the physical structure required gradual decisions, extensive negotiations, and complex reconfigurations. The difference was not only in technology, it was in elasticity. Physical infrastructures have weight. Digital infrastructures have flexibility. For years, weight was synonymous with strength. Then it became synonymous with inertia. The confidence was not unfounded. It was based on decades of market dominance. But past dominance does not guarantee future adaptation. And when a system gets used to winning under a certain set of rules, it can take time to realize that the rules have changed. Change is rarely formally announced. It seeps into preferences, into comparisons, into silent expectations. When consumers began to expect instant access, the logic of physical displacement lost its centrality. When access became more important than temporary ownership, shelf space ceased to be a strategic advantage. The transition was not emotional, it was functional. and functional processes rarely generate immediate alarm.
They believed they were managing a transition. They didn't realize they were crossing an irreversible point.
The point of no return is rarely identified at the moment it occurs. It only becomes evident in retrospect, when the margin has already been consumed, when the reaction is already insufficient, when gradual adjustments no longer compensate for the accumulated structural difference. Blockbuster tried to adapt, but it tried while it still needed to sustain the previous model. This duality consumes resources, it consumes focus, it consumes time. And time once again was the scarcest element. The collapse did not begin with the bankruptcy announcement. It began when stability was interpreted as evidence of permanence. It began when historical success reduced urgency in proportion to emerging risk. It began when incremental changes were classified as too tolerable to require disruption. The digital company was the visible event. Trust was the invisible process. Invisible processes operate silently until they exceed the projected limit. When the last store closed, the public narrative treated the moment as a symbol of technological transformation. But technology was not the only variable. Margin was. The margin projected based on the past proved insufficient for the pace of the future. Confidence in the ability to adapt proved dependent on a mistaken assumption about speed. Complex systems rarely collapse because they completely ignore risk. They collapse because they recalibrate urgency too slowly. Each Blockbuster decision could be defended within the context in which it was made. Maintaining rates made financial sense. Expanding stores reinforced territorial presence. Refusing acquisition seemed economically prudent. Gradually integrating digital seemed balanced. Nothing seemed irrational. And that is exactly why the pattern repeats itself. Because contextual rationality does not prevent structural displacement. It can even delay its perception. The problem was not a lack of intelligence, it was overconfidence in the margin. When stability lasts long enough, it becomes an assumption. And assumptions are rarely questioned as long as they still produce results. Blockbuster was not the victim of a single mistake. It was the victim of a series of reasonable decisions made under assumptions that became progressively inadequate. The event was visible. The process was silent. And silent processes are the hardest to interrupt.
The problem was never innovation. It was the certainty that there was still time.
The collapse did not begin when the competitor grew. It began when the competitor's growth still seemed too small to matter. It began when permanence seemed logical. It began when confidence seemed sufficient evidence. Collapses rarely begin with panic. They begin with certainty. And that is why they are almost never recognized in time.